Hello, boys and girls. How are we doing this fine evening? You're invited to a performance that might scare you, that might terrify you, that might make you lose your grip on reality. Tonight, I'm going to read you an extract from a story that scared the pants off me. I'm reading a story tonight because our dear beloved Smugbug is no longer with us. And I can only hope by reading from this book of Dark Arcana, I can summon the energies to bring him back. If that should fail, not really much I can do, to be honest. Just kind of over, really, you know? I thought I'd read something from one of my favourite authors, a gentleman called Garth Marenghi, an esteemed cultural author. The book itself, it's called Pondscum, or The God Socket. Chapter 1. What do you mean podcast 911? Get out of here. Or stay. It's up to you. But yeah, Smug's dead. That's what's going on here. Chapter 1. Let me get into my reading voice. Soul Survivor. A black plume of smoke rose high over Stalvik Airport as another fuel tank exploded. Air traffic controller Sky Pickens, a peripheral character who we won't be able to see again in the story, flicked a big switch on the console in front of him, signaling around to ground control to wave in a fresh fleet of ambulances. Flight SA-13 had landed. The front of the plane alone was intact, its rear fuselage having disintegrated completely upon an impact. The blackened nose of the stricken Airbus lay at an angle on the gouged and scorch-marked runway, its inflatable stairway buffeted in all directions by powerful gusts from the evening's unexpected but ultimately deadly August storm. Their torrents of rain lashed hard against the strewn and scattered wreckage. They did little to dispel the rising smoke and flames. Detached street seats and strewn luggage lay in shattered pieces as far as the eye could see, glowing fiercely in the night like hot coals. What pieces remained of the jumbo's splintered interior lay crisp and blackened on the concrete like burned, smoking chips in a giant oven tray. As if catapulted luggage were the stricken plane's metaphorical vegetable. Then what remained of the passengers themselves was its undigested crackling, a purple-brownish cluster of bubbling, charred body meat, whose scent was borne upon the whipping breeze like the unholiest of gravies. Medics and firemen moved steadily through the wreckage, lighting much-needed fags from the frizzled husks to steady their nerves before dousing what remained of the dead in industrial-strength extinguisher foam. As they progressed gradually towards the twisted struts of the jumbo's melted gallery, nobody glimpsed the small flurry of movement occurring inside the plane's teetering cockpit. No one spied the human figure forcing its way through a smashed window in the main cabin or clambering sideways over the nose towards the jumbo's crumpled left wing. The man, for the figure, wore trousers with clothes in uniform, and although his shirt was covered with flecks of blood and spattered jet fuel, there was no mistaking the captain's stripes on both lapels. For this was the pilot of the downed Airbus, the sole survivor. Wow, what an opening. What a brilliant opening. I don't know about you guys, but I'm fucking terrified. Oh, buddy. Not an easy book to read. As the figure dropped to the floor of the runway from the bent wing and collected his suitcase from the mangled food trolley melting rapidly against one of the Boeing's vast dislocated landing wheels, a nearby fireman looked up from a smoking skull and nodded at him. "Evening, Nick." "Evening, Steve," replied the pilot, still hardly believing that this was his profession now, having worked primarily as a best-selling horror novelist for the last 30 years. With a palpable air of nonchalance, he transferred the single-breasted Oxford blue pilot blazer from his right arm and tugged on it, elevating one of its padded collars over his head to shield his smooth and smoky topaz mane from the relentless rain. "Welcome, Salford Airport, Captain Steen," said one of the paramedics, smiling wryly as he held out an object in his hand. "I think you dropped this." The captain reached over and took back his pilot's cap, which had become dislodged from his head mid-crash. Like him, had miraculously escaped any lasting damage from the plane's catastrophic impact with the ground and subsequent inferno. He winked at the medic, acknowledging the man's excellent display of dry wit amid trying circumstances, then popped the cap swiftly over his thick, lustrous hair and marched at a professional pace towards the airport's main building across the runway. "I'll remember it next time," he called out behind him, as the rescue crews continued their work, the grim task of recovery destined to occupy them, as always, long into the night. "Next time," reflected Nick Steen, former best-selling horror novel author, turned doom airplane pilot for Salford Airways to himself. "Next time." There was always a next time. With the circumstances of the horrific air accident Nick found himself emerging from had once been nothing more than more real than a series of calamitous events described within the pages of one of his own horror novels. Published more than 20 years earlier, The Portentor, or Pondertoror for the US edition, had recounted the chilling story of Captain Gary Tracker, commercial air pilot and sole survivor of the devastating plane crash. Caught in a supernatural time warp, Tracker is forced to endure a never-ending cycle of near-identical aviation accidents from which he emerges continually as a sole survivor. To make matters worse, each fresh air disaster is foretold uncannily in Tracker's mind via recurring portentums, hence Portentor. An eerie psychokinetic ability to see future events before they happen. This has, somehow, been engineered by Tracker's initial crash, and with each fresh accident only increases its intensity, meaning he's soon caught in an endless cycle of death prefiguration, followed by near-death experience, followed by death prefiguration, followed by near-death experience, etc. It's a total nightmare. The book's cover had depicted the sinister image of a man's face, half pilot, half skull, with a jumbo jet spiraling in terrifying death arc directly through a hole in the protagonist's nose, splitting the forehead above it in two white lightning both eye sockets with subtly rendered bursts of exploding jet fuel. These symbolized in visual terms the pupils of death that would ultimately curse the book's hero with uncanny physical foresight. For, as Tracker gradually discovered, he's not just developing a psychic ability to foretell events, but also one that can influence them as well. And with that devastating realization comes yet another even more devastating realization, that Gary Tracker has somehow emerged from this never-ending cycle of disasters and a god among men, and not a particularly benevolent one. It was a dense cluster of truly frightening premises. And with Nick's name rendered solidly in the embossed gold lettering above the cover's central image, and the book's title displayed prominently below it in electric blue, The Portentor had proved to be one of Nick's most terrifying novels. And on the page it should have remained. Yet, now, owing to Nick Steen's imagination having escaped from his mind, seeping out continuously from his head for several months following his accidental opening a portal to another dimension, having once engaged in a shady physical relations with a cursed typewriter. The book in question had suddenly sprung to life. Now Nick Steen himself was caught up in the mist of a destructive, portentary maelstrom unleashed by his own writing. Nick Steen was Gary Tracker in all but name. And with each fresh air accident and terrifying brush with death, deepening psychokinetic abilities were gradually manifesting themselves inside Nick's own brain. Not just an ability to foresee the future, but additional ones as well. Like boiling an egg using only the power of his mind. Currently the process took over 4 hours, meaning it was ultimately more practical to use a pan, but who knew what other terrifying psychic powers might soon awaken inside his brain. And in that, Nick fervently believed lay Salford's ultimate salvation. Or if he could somehow continue to endure these nightly plane crashes, knowing he'd ultimately and miraculously walk away from the plane uninjured, sole survivor every time, then maybe, just maybe, he could develop those latent psychic abilities enough to become the all-powerful psychic force depicted in the original novel. Then he could at long last turn the table on the rampaging demonic visions, defeat them once and for all, thus saving Suffolk and the surrounding counties from ultimate destruction. Plus, get the egg boiling down to under a minute, max. Nick blew a disbelieving whistle from his lips, awestruck by the sheer magnitude of the task that lay ahead. Before all that, he needed to relax, recharge, cop some badly needed Z's. He slapped his forehead suddenly, remembering he had a date with Julia. Damn it! Former air stewardess, now female air traffic control assistant, whose surname he couldn't remember, and whose life he'd saved from a premature death by firing her aggressively from her first job for serving him tepid coffee in the morning of that initial disastrous flight SA-13 to Bodega. Nick smiled, recalling the memory. He wondered where he could take Julia tonight, before realising with sudden regret that he'd agreed to let her make that decision. No doubt it meant a prolonged bout of late-night shopping in the duty-free lounge before any hint of petting could commence. Perhaps he should just fire her again. Breaking free from his thoughts, Nick saluted the team of arriving air accident investigators. High five Marcus, their accompanying critical incident officer, and passed through a door into the main terminal building. He took up an escalator to the main concourse and followed the elusive Crurain through to customs. Nice flight? Asked the customs officer, Fran Locker, whom Nick was also dating, though not as frequently as he was Julia. It was, Nick joked. Maybe some deeply probing questions would soften you up, she said, cracking her knuckles. How about a brief, bruising body search in one of the security cells? Not tonight, Fran, Nick said, knowing that such a physical parley would only instigate another public catfight between her and Julia, which Nick would no doubt have to referee again. Frowning, Fran handed him a scrawled note. Roz Bloom, she said. Can you phone her back? She said it's urgent. It's always urgent with Roz, said Nick as he passed through baggage retrieval, waving away a thick smoke from the revolving stream of charred luggage before heading into departures. As a waiting crowd of photographers and news journalists flashed their cameras at him, vying for attention, in the hope of an interview skip with Salford's miracle survivor, Nick scanned the concourse in vain for Julia, then moved into the drinks lounge. He ordered his usual complimentary whiskey from Phillips. The barmaid, who Nick had also considered dating after Julia and Fran, then crossed over to an empty booth and dialed Roz's number. Well, he asked. His former editor picked up the phone. I heard about the incident, Roz said, stifling tears. A big one, they said. Yeah, devastating, Nick replied. But I'm okay, thank God. Stop crying. But Nick, Roz whispered, swallowing tears. What about the others? What others? They're dead and dying, Nick. The dead, Roz. The rest have stopped breathing. I'm the sole survivor, remember? But there's so many now, Nick. If you actually count up all the various crash casualties, which I won't. There are over 3,000 now, Nick. 3,000 lost souls. And you seem utterly unconcerned about every single one of them. Correct. To you, those endless devastating air disasters are simply routine flights. Nick sighed, hardly believing that he was needing to go through all this again. Like I've told you numerous times, Roz, I'm the victim here. I'm the one dealing with the persistent day-to-day trauma of it all. I'm the one emerging from each crash the sole survivor with all the psychological disorientation and the confusion that entails. Not only that, but I'm also having to handle these emerging psychokinetic powers of mine, namely an unnerving psychic awareness of the future events, and as of late, last night, a creepy egg-boiling ability. All that lot have to do is die. He realised he was speaking too loudly. People were turning in their seats to watch. There he is, Nick imagined them thinking. Captain Steen, the air disaster guy, that Sky Jonah who sees the future. Well, they're wrong, Nick thought angrily, downing his whiskey in one. Not at least because Jonah is a phrase referring to an unlikely seaman, not an airman, even if they added Sky at the front of an attempt to legitimise their mistake, the twats. He dashed his tumbler to the floor, which failed to smash as he's intended, being a plastic one. He turned his face from the other patrons, embarrassed, wishing bitterly that he'd been able to predict that eventuality. Damn it! Why was Roz always on his back about these bloody air disasters? You're knowingly flying innocents to their doom, Nick, Roz snapped suddenly in his ear. Night after night. Doesn't your conscience care about that? Whether it cares or not, Roz, there's a good reason I'm flying these lost souls to an early grave. I'm developing my psychic abilities, which are improving with each fresh disaster. At some point, they've developed sufficiently enough for me to be able to destroy once and for all these escaping horrors of my mind. I'm actually saving the world here, Roz, not just a few thousand tightwads on some doomed weekend budget flight from Ibiza. Sure, it's sad, I get that, but these are pawns in a cosmic game that has to be played for the sake of mankind. I'm almost there, Roz, I can feel it. I may not be able to bend a spoon with my mind just yet, but I can certainly dull the shine on a brass ornament following 8 weeks of concentrated staring. One day very soon, I'll become so powerful that I'll be able to single-handedly defeat all those horrors that my mind has inadvertently unleashed upon unsuspecting humanity. And what new psychokinetic ability have you developed tonight? Asked Roz, her voice calmer now. How close are you getting? Nick thought for a moment. I'm not quite sure, Roz. Now that you mention it, I can't detect any notable change in my telekinetic power since tonight's disaster, but I'm sure it will manifest sooner or later. He looked down at his watch. He was late for Julia. Correction, Julia was early for him. Gotta go, he said. Wait, Nick, there's one more thing. You must remember that other book you wrote. I write lots of books, Roz. That other aviation-based soul disasters-themed horror series. Nick's eyes screwed up, shut, trying to recall the book in question. Death Flap, Roz said, jogging his memory. Nick winced inwardly. He'd forgotten all about Death Flap. What about Death Flap? And the sequels, Nick, Roz says. Don't forget the sequels. Death Flap 2, Death Flap Flaps Back, Death Flap 3, The Flappening, Death Flap 4. Cut to the chase, Roz, Nick said, after all the series has gone all the way up to Death Flap 85, aka Flapocalypse 4. Death Flap vs. Squawker. Well, in case you need reminding, Nick, the Death Flap series also featured the sole survivor of a plane crash. Only that character, Steve Tracker, wasn't haunted by paternidums, Nick. He was haunted by death itself. Nick shuddered, suddenly remembering there was a reason he'd put all those books out of his mind. Correction, Roz, he said, trying to keep calm. Steve Tracker was haunted by Death Flap, not death. Well, whatever the actual name, Nick, Death Flap was a terrifying embodiment of the Grim Reaper in half-skeleton, half-pterodactyl form. And if you remember, it pursued Steve Tracker because he'd eluded death, escaped it, crash after crash, but it came for him in the end, Nick, precisely because Steve Tracker had spurred death escape. Night after eerie night, the deadly flapping of Deathbird's bony webbed wing embrace. Death Flap's wings were partially feathered, Roz. That series ended, Nick, said Roz, ignoring him, because Clackett issued you with an ultimatum. Either Death Flap finally catches up with Steve Tracker in a concluding volume, or the series gets cancelled anyway. Bloody Clackett, Nick moaned inwardly. Perhaps he should invite his former publishers on board his next flight. Then he sensed Roz was gearing up for something more. Come on then, Roz, Nick said. Spit it out. Death Flap is abroad, Nick. Where? Mogadishu? The Canary Islands? Abroad in the supernatural sense, Nick, i.e. round reports are coming in of a leathery, skull-like demon crossing international airspace, Nick. Deathflap's coming for you. Damn it, that's all he needed. Another sole survivor aviation-based horror novel of his invading current living embodiment. The sole survivor aviation-based horror of his. Sure, rot, said Nick, putting it out of his mind. Hell, he had enough horrors to contend with on a daily basis, didn't he? One more couldn't hurt. I'll keep an eye out. Make sure you do, Nick, because at some point Deathflap itself is going to catch up with you. Soul survivor or no soul survivor? Well, he can flap off as far as I'm concerned, Nick barked, then hung up. Ignoring the stares from the surrounding drinkers, he grabbed his flight case and marched back out into departures. Julia was there at last, standing where he'd told her to meet him, directly outside the Gents' Loos. You're early, he said coldly. I'm sorry, Nick, Julia replied, puckering her lips. He attempted a heavy pet, but was immediately rebuffed. I thought we'd try duty-free perfume aisle tonight. Sure, Nick said wearily. Evidently his nightly brushes with death were starting to pale with her. Or we could just go back to mine? Not tonight, Nick. I'm shopping, said Julia, already racing off towards the glow of lights gleaming in the distant perfume counter. He paused, considering calling a taxi for one, and then saw two men in suits holding up a piece of cardboard with his name on it. Captain Steen, said the taller of the two. Yes. We're here to take you to the awards ceremony. Awards ceremony? Replied Nick, confused. What awards ceremony? Why, to honour your extensive achievement in the best-selling horror fiction. Did you receive our invitation? No, said Nick, confused. He couldn't remember receiving anything, though he'd hardly been home between flights, he reflected. He had asked Julia to sort through his mail and do the cooking and cleaning while he was away. No doubt she tossed out the invitation along with all those gone-off cartons of salad he refused to touch. He examined the two men closely. The youngest was tall, blonde-haired, and of slim build. He wore a pair of mirrored shades. The man beside him was holding up a piece of card, was older and heavier than his companion. This guy was balding, slightly. A pair of long greying sideburns crawled, drawing his hair downward, away from what looked like an old medical scar stretching halfway across his forehead. The man's hands spotted a pair of black leather driving gloves and grasped the length of card tightly, crushing his side. Both men wore sharp-looking suits, the younger's tailored dark navy affair, his companion's a grey functional off the peg. Maybe these guys were on the level. One thing was for certain. Neither of them were part skeleton, part pterodactyl, and what harm could an award do him anyway? Having investigated a devastating supernatural catastrophe directly threatening the entire future of the human race, Nick's profile could do with a bit of positive publicity. Why not, said Nick. Let's go. The older man took Nick's flight case from him and ushered him outside, out by the taxi rank. The man's blonde-haired companion pointing towards their waiting car, which displayed a prominent logo down one side. Nulltech, Nick read. Nulltech. He knew that name, but before he could remember where from exactly, he was struck by the vision. That was chapter 1, gang. How we doing? What a novel. Where do we think this is going? I, for one, am absolutely, I don't know, invested. What a book. What the fuck is this, Wiz? It's a horror novel. We're doing this is what the channel is now. It's creepy. It's scary. It's whoa. Shall we keep going? This is one of my favorite authors. What horror novel? Portentum by Garth Marenghi. It's a great little book. Why are you saying what novel? You drew this book. I mean, I'm just taking some water. Yeah. What do you feel when you're afraid? I get scared. I don't know. This book's when I first read this book, I shot myself 3 times. First in anticipation, second time in terror, the third time was because the first two had cleared a big long bout of constipation I had, and suddenly my pipes were free. To do with that as you will. I took it from the Buenos Aires library. Anti-establishmentarianism. Right. Let's get back into this. Chapter 2. Why is the music that loud? Do you want me to turn the music down, chat? Music down low. Right, okay. Yeah, why didn't you guys say? If you can't hear what I'm saying. Okay. Chapter 2, Nulltech. The earth passing below Nick was smooth yet sallow, like festering creme fraiche. Its vast surface appeared to dip at either side of the distant horizon, like the slopping curvature of some colossal ball of brie. As Nick descended further towards this pasty plain, he perceived that he was gliding over the surface of some dying planet. Swaths of stunted vegetation materialized as he descended towards its surface, exposing stubs of withered flora and fauna sprouting weakly under tepid rays of the alien sun. What were those follicles? As Nick flew on, it seemed to him, in his dreamlike state, he was once more piloting another doomed plane, yet one whose wings, according to the pilot's readout, were now part organic and webbed, if not leathered, form. As the unknown air vessel transporting him continued onwards towards the distant horizon, beyond which lay an infinity of black, starless sky, Nick began to entertain the unnerving notion that he was passing over something far more dreadful than a mere dying planet. For as Nick's speed began to increase, his eyes gradually perceived the contours of a giant mauve lake staining the planet's surface. A lake that looked very much like to Nick, a colossal liver spot. His mind froze in a sudden paroxysm of crippling cosmic horror as he realized he was in fact traversing at extreme speed the aging, balding pate of a gargantuan human head. His own. Nick screamed himself awake. As both eyes snapped open, he saw that he was in the back seat of a moving vehicle. With a notable lack of street lights outside, his passenger window suggested they'd long since left the outskirts of the city airport. The two men in suits sat up front. "Where are we?" asked Nick, unable to remember getting inside the car. "On our way," said the older man who was driving. Nick caught his eye in the rearview mirror, staring back at him, watching. "On our way where?" "To the awards ceremony," said the younger man in the passenger seat. "You've won the Nolman Prize, remember?" "The Nolman Prize," Nick repeated, trying his best to recall the award. It was useless. Nick had only ever won prizes with demonic entities in the title, yet he knew that name from somewhere. "The award recognizes your stunning achievements in the art of literary incarnation," the blonde man continued, "bringing fictional reality to life. It's an award invented solely for you. Perhaps I invented it, Nick quipped. Neither man laughed. "We don't joke about Dr. Nolman," the blonde man said. "Nolman?" Nick's mind started racing. He knew that name, too. But from where? "If I'm to receive an award," he said, testing the wall, "then surely I ought to be provided with some complimentary refreshments." "Naturally," said the younger man, turning almost immediately to offer Nick a mini bottle of scotch from the passenger seat's compartment. Nick took the drink, glancing at the rearview mirror again as he did so. The driver was still staring at him, and Nick had the uncanny feeling the man hadn't looked at the road ahead at any point during the last 3 minutes. Still suffering from a headache from his terrifying portentum, Nick downed the scotch and won. "The Nolman Prize is much coveted, Mr. Steele, an award for supreme achievement in literary fiction. It represents formal acknowledgement of your vast accomplishments in the field of creative world building. Literal world building, in my case, quipped Nick again, smiling dryly at his own pithy wit. Again, neither men laughed. About time, said Nick, taking another scotch from the younger man's hand as the driver continued to watch Nick's movement via the rearview. A toast then, gentlemen, said Nick, to myself and the so-called literati who have been erroneously to sing my oeuvre for the past 20 years. Nick downed his second scotch, hoping he was fooling them. Maybe it was the rush of booze, or those two eyes piercing him from the mirror in the glass in front. But something didn't add up. Why, when the entire world was threatened by Nick's escaping imagination, would a literary elite wish to honour him for unleashing this horde of fictional demons? Something stank. Unexpectedly, the vehicle lurched sharply to the left, swerving over the road as a rush of headlights swooped past them on the other side. Apologies, said the driver, righting the vehicle while keeping his eyes trained continually on Nick. At this rate, they'll all be dead in 5 minutes. Who's Noman? Nick asked, still racking his brain for the answer. Barbara Noman, said the younger man, reaching into his passenger compartment for a third mini bottle of scotch. He turned around and handed it to Nick. Dr. Barbara Noman. Damn it! Nick knew that name. But from where? He downed his third drink, trying in vain to remember. As he did so, the car left the road, turning left down a muddy lane, heading towards a vast spread of approaching forest. Where's this award ceremony being held? Asked Nick, confused by the looming greenery. It better not be a writer's retreat. Nick hated writer's retreats. He'd only ever attended one, and had been thrown out within the first hour for ridiculing everyone else's fledgling efforts. Whilst perceived wisdom regarded writers' retreats as a place to share one's work in progress and receive constructive criticism from fellow scribes, Nick took the opposite view. Criticism and constructive were mutually exclusive words. For Nick, a writer's retreat meant precisely that, an opportunity to ensure competing writers ran as far from his explosive wrath as possible, thereby easing his own pathway to success. Rest assured, it's no writer's retreat, said the blonde man. For one thing, the place we're heading towards has excellent conference parking. Wait a moment, thought Nick, his mind racing again. That phrase, excellent conference parking. He'd heard it before, hadn't he? Yes, it was a slogan. Damn it. A slogan on some brochure he'd once read. And then finally, he remembers. The sign on the side of the car. Nick hadn't clocked it at the time his mind had been immediately besieged by a terrifying premonition of male baldness. But now he recalled the company's logo. Nulltech. He peered through the windscreen at the road ahead, against the distant tree line. Nick saw a grim grey building looming into view. Nulltech. A place hardly anyone in Stalkford knew about. A stark, concrete building, situated somewhere off the D60 on the border of Chokewood Forest, housed in a fenced-off stretch of open ground, formerly owned by the Defence Department of Stalford City Council. Nulltech. The word itself gave Nick the creeps, for this was a place Nick knew only too well. Having unearthed rumours about it during an intense hour's worth of research for his mutated virus novel, The Milky Strain. It was a high-tech medical research facility specialising in unconventional scientific experiments, hardly the kind of venue for a supposed literary event. Quit shitting me, said Nick. You people aren't awarding me a prize at all, are you? The driver's eyes finally turned from the rear view seat mirror, shifting towards the road ahead for the first time, and the fast approaching concrete building. Hey, I'm talking to you, buddy, spat Nick gruffly, even though he wasn't the guy's buddy at all, not even remotely his buddy. As the car drew up alongside Nulltech, Nick leaned forward in his seat, his eyes drawn to the place he'd read so little about during that brief, crucial trip to Stalford Library. The large central building was of the late 60s construction, rectangular in shape, yet corporate in feel, formed on each side from steel girders and smooth concrete, which daylight would have revealed was dyed in a light shade of beige. The main premises was formed of 3 floors, Nick counted, and the facility's main entrance doors were shielded under a wide, protruding porch, which gave it the feel that Nick felt polished. almost as if a great deal of cash had been thrown at the place in recent years. A range of ancillary buildings adjoined its central structure, and they were indeed, Nick noted now, some excellent conference parking facilities. But at this late hour, the building looked empty. Visible through the glass door panelling, Nick made out an unmanned welcome deck with an empty chair lit by a dim light of dormant computer screen. The bulk of the lobby's interior was suffused with electrical pink glow radiating from the row tail of sodium lamps erected outside. As the car ascended a paved ramp leading up to the main drop-off, Nick clocked the building's signpost. Nulltech, your tomorrow is our today. Chief Evolver, Dr. Barbara Nolman. A long list of letters followed the name, eventually taking up 3 additional signposts. Of course, Nick suddenly recalled. Nolman, Dr. Barbara Nolman. Nick knew who she was, all right. That damned cow. Okay, boys, he said, necking the last of his complimentary scotch. You've had your fun. Now what say you swing us back round to the airport again, because I'm not going anywhere near the vicinity of that woman. Then the tranquilizers they'd been feeding him finally kicked in. The gag in his mouth muffled Nick's screams as a long row of harsh strip lights passed vertically overhead. Both arms and legs were bound to a gurney, and he was being wheeled at an immense speed down a long, white, cylindrical-looking corridor. Nick tried to angle his head sideways so that he could see who precisely was wheeling him, but his gaze remained fixed on the ceiling above. Evidently his neck had been restrained, Nick concluded, or else he'd been drugged with some form of highly illegal muscle relaxant serum. A deep judder shot through Nick's spine as the metal gurney slammed into a set of swinging doors, barging them open. As they swung to behind him, Nick felt himself being transported onwards down another featureless corridor of endless white wall. He continued to scream through his gagged mouth, though no one heeded his cries. He wondered exactly how the hell he got here. One moment he'd been swallowing that 3rd helping of scotch and telling those 2 planks in no uncertain terms that he wasn't about to engage in another bout of turgid philosophical debate with the former Nobel Prize winner. And then, nothing. Nick had simply blacked out, then awoken here, strapped to a metal gurney, with hands and legs bound on each side. Fighting off panic, Nick attempted to apply logic to his predicament, though he bore all apparent trappings of some ailing hospital patient or gibbering asylum nutcase. Nick knew he was sound in both body and mind. That presumably meant he was not technically a patient here, but a prisoner instead, a hostage, a captive, a detainee, an incarcerate. But where exactly was he imprisoned? Who was imprisoning him, and why? On reflection, Nick knew knew the answers to 2 of the questions already. The first being Nulltech, presumably the second, and the second, the head of the aforementioned Nulltech, that damn sanctimonious cow, Dr. Barbara Nolman, meaning Nick really only needed to ask himself that final question. Why? He attempted in vain to shake his head. He didn't yet have the answer to that particular question, but as the gurney crashed through another set of double doors onto a corridor slightly darker in colour than the previous one, yet still essentially white, if more of an off-white, Nick suspected he was about to find out. He couldn't be certain due to his restricted view, but Nick suddenly sensed a glow of electrical pink light coming from what he thought were banks of monitors set onto the adjacent walls. As he was pushed through another set of double doors, still screaming, and continued to scream through his gag as the gurney turned harshly to the right and crashed through yet another set of double doors. Nick sensed the pink glow intensifying until finally he suspected that these endless, featureless corridors he was travelling down were no longer entirely featureless and in fact bore certain features. Drawing much needed breath through both his nostrils, Nick screwed his eyes shut against the searing glare of the powerful overhead lights snapping on above him. A loud metallic grinding numbed his ears. Nick felt his body being tipped suddenly forward to a sitting position. Then someone placed his own spectacles back on his head. He blinked both eyes forcefully, attempting to rid both retinas of harsh afterglow caused by 2 giant overhead surgical lamps. Then slowly, lifted his neck. A bandaged face, allowing only a glimpse of 2 eyes and a human nose, confronted him. As Nick flinched in fright, the figure flinched in fright in front of him. He was staring at his own reflection. He realised Nick's entire body was bound in bandages from head to toe, with medical clamps securing him stiffly to the trolley. As he watched, various pairs of hands reached in from either side of his body to unwind, roughly and without any hint of surgical grace, the soiled and bloody medical dressings surrounding his aching cranium. Feeling a layer of gauze being yanked free from his mouth area, Nick attempted to speak, but was immediately silenced by a violent slap from a pair of nearby hands. He could do little then but watch his own reflection as assembled mitts continued to unwind the bandage from around his head, strip by strip, until at long last the final dressing was removed to reveal beneath. He closed both his eyes, unable to take in the monstrous sight confronting him. For Nick Steen was no longer Nick Steen. Nick Steen, he realised, using the third person to disassociate himself entirely from the current proceedings, was bald. Totally, utterly bald. End of chapter 2. How are we doing, my children? That wasn't too frightening for you, was it? I know these things can be hard. First time I read that, I shat myself. Can you imagine waking up bald? Without your will? Against your will? Oh. Yeah, Smug's dead. We're reading a book in his to try and bring him back using evil, potent psychic energies. Remember to like the stream, guys. Like the stream and follow, and like and subscribe. Or something like that. Hair transplant novel? We can only hope. We can only hope at this point. Why all the hate for bald guys? It's not hate, it's terror. It's sheer terror. It's stuff that keeps you up at night, you know? Or what is more frightening? That's what I want to know. What is more frightening? Oh man, I don't know if I can keep going. My hands are shaking. Oh. Not easy, I tell you that much. Reading this again. Didn't think I'd ever have the strength to come back to this place. Guys, if you want to donate, I know there's no donor bar, just because I'm not, expecting anything. If you want to chuck some coins my way, if you like this type of reading stream that I'll probably never ever do again, make sure to know the fish should be working. If he's not, I'm sorry. But yeah. Alright, I'm gonna dive back in. Are you guys ready? Are you guys plugged in? You guys belted up? You guys got your warm hot chocolate? Your creamy tea? Let's fucking go. I'm hooked in. Okay, good. I'm logged in as well. Let me take a little sip. Oh, chapter 3. Incarcerate. Bald. Then the terrifying vision had indeed come to pass. Bald. Nick felt the anger rising up within him. They'd shaved him. The bastards. Shorn him of his beloved locks. So roughly too, he noted. Once he'd mustered sufficient courage to reopen both his eyes and confront the horror head on, that grazed patches of torn skin now peppered his head like sliced salami scattering. Baldery! Free his neck, said a vehement voice, harsh and businesslike in timbre. A no-nonsense voice. The voice of a ball-busting female who gets things done. A voice that's stamped hard when necessary, harder when unnecessary. A voice that Nick guessed might howl and snarl like a raging tigress atop a quivering body of some floored and subservient lover. The voice of one tough-talking, sultry-walking, chiseled diamond female canine. A fresh set of hands appeared at Nick's side, said, and deftly removed his neck restraint. I don't know what the story is, I can't focus on it. What's wrong? It's alright, it's okay. He could see her in the mirror now, a knot of golden hair, bunched neatly behind a bold and prominent forehead. Two amber eyes pierced Nick's own with a stern yet inquisitory... I'll let the... Speak, fish.
Why does with fake bull does so much? Not gonna lie, it's not a great look, my guy. Us bodies have hard enough lives without the constant hate and paranoia.
Hey, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with being bald, you know? As you guys know, I'm bald. I'm a bald guy. Okay? I'm just telling you, it's just what the book says. Thanks for $5. You can see her in the mirror now, a knot of golden hair bunched neatly behind a bold and prominent forehead. Two amber eyes pierced Nick's own with a stern yet inquisitory intensity. A smear of functional lipstick coloured a deceptively plain-looking face, which Nick suspected rarely smiled. She was around 40, he guessed, wearing large glasses in golden frames, matching Nick in both size and severity. A pair of gold-hooped earrings completed the portrait of a stern, no-nonsense professionalism. Yet Nick sensed a spark of passion buried under the austerity countenance. That's two words I can't say. That's embarrassing. Whoops. A stale yet not displeasing smoky scent wafted upwards from the yellowing leaves. Her lab coat, as she smothered Nick's bruised shoulders, mixed with an aroma of hastily chewed cherry breath mints. The firm lines on either side of her mouth confirmed it. This woman was a serious smoker. As she stood back from him for the moment, Nick couldn't help but clock cold yet commanding formality of the woman's caramel-plaid skirt. That ended. Nevertheless, some way above her knees, exposing beneath the coppery shiver of her smooth, unladdered work stocking. As the woman leaned over him again to rub a cold cotton pad across his cheeks, Nick noted the advanced length of her fingernails. Hardly a practical choice for the hard-working medical professional, he figured. And there were small areas too that had evidently escaped the woman's regular polish removal regime. These tiny flecks betrayed her hint of choice. A deep burgundy red. Nick wondered if she ever wore lipstick that color. I apologise for the current state of attire, she said, smoothing the compress over his brow. Don't, said Nick, thankful for the pad's cooling touch. It's maybe better you dress down. I meant you, the woman said matter-of-factly. Naltec requires all patients to be stripped, searched, prosed, hosed, shaved, probed again, intimately, photographed, post-probed, fiddled with, then probed again before a full but not necessary final probing. Ah, thought Nick tentatively, flexing his buttock cheeks. So that is what's happening. I'm Barbara Nolman, he said. I know, Nick replied, not quite able to believe he was facing the Nobel Prize winner in the flesh. So this was to do with revenge, then? Is this about my book? The Hissing Link, he asked. Not at all, replied Nolman, even if it was a fairly obvious and damning caricature. He was right on that score, Nick had to admit, though he'd fallen shy of naming Nolman outright on the advice of Clackert's lawyers. The story of Dr. Barbara McDowell's in Nick's dystopian mutant gene novel had indeed been an intentional critique of Nolman's most famous medical discovery. Hell, Nick had been sore, that was all. But why the hell not? For in one single night, Nolman had discovered how to extract the R complex from the brains of human beings, and by doing so had developed a scientific method of evolving mankind that had effectively kicked Nick's lifelong mission to do the same via horror fiction into the proverbial dust. The R complex is our deep-rooted reptilian instinct, also known as the basal ganglia or the basal nuclei, containing the brainstem, limbic region, and amygdala. The main reason that human beings murder, maim, draw penises inside books, and hog the middle lane. But Nolman had won a Nobel Prize that year. Nick had won Best Tentacle Death in the nautical category of Port Talbot's rescheduled Shocker Con for his killer coral novel, The Coral What Killed. Not that he wasn't proud of the award, but a Nobel Prize could have well nudged his novel sales into double figures. Since then, he'd done his best to forget the entire thing and had largely succeeded, until tonight. We've been studying you for some time, Mr. Steen. It's Captain Steen. She smiled at him briefly, then stopped. I think we can dispense with the whole captain nonsense. My name is Captain Nicholas Steen, Nick repeated stiffly. Serial number 13666. That's all the information you'll get out of me. Mr. Steen, giving your fictional pilot persona a flight identity number consisting of the unluckiest number, along with another signifying the supposed number of the beast, is cliched and entirely implausible. Genuine pilots use call signs, not numbers. Neither do professional airline companies employ those same numerals for any routine flight numbers in order to avoid outbreaks of superstitious panic and inevitable ridicule. She snapped her fingers. Immediately, the 3 lab assistants who'd wheeled Nick in swung his gurney around 100. He now found himself facing a wide bank of visual monitors, hitherto masked from view. On each screen played raw, unedited footage of air accident recovery scenes, a vast pool of graphic newsreel depicting the grim aftermath of numerous plane disasters. Nick observed shots of wreckage being sifted through, smoking corpses being doused with fire extinguishers, then quietly looted by arriving emergency crews. He recognised the familiar flight serial numbers on several pieces of strewn wreckage. He'd flown every single one of those damn planes. We've detected that you are currently inhabiting the pilot of your 1999 novel, The Portenter, said Norman. Tell me, have you been experiencing any of these so-called portentums? Any ominous prefigurations or psychic premonitions as a result of these recurring crashes? Nick suddenly caught sight of himself on the various monitor screens, emerging, sole survivor from every stricken plane. Bathed in flame, yet somehow completely uninjured, and inside his brain, with every fate, the awakening of some latent psychic ability. Powers, Nick now sensed, as Norman ran her long nails and hands over his shoulders, that he ought to keep secret from. I can boil an egg with my mind, said Nick, but that's about it. You're lying, Mr. Steen, Norman pointed at the numerous dials and data measuring devices spaced between each monitor. Our scanners can pick up thoughts and visions you experience, either conscious or unconscious. What do you want from me? Officially here at Nulltech, we explore the fullest reaches of human consciousness, Mr. Steen. We specialise in extrasensory powers, telepathic communication, psychokinetic abilities. And unofficially? That's classified, Norman replied, casually wafting away a cloud of smoke from her latest cigarette. You are a very special subject, Mr. Steen. Somewhere deep in your cerebral hemispheres, housed in an undefined area between your frontal, temporal and parental lobes, there lies a bridge. A bridge between your 3 warning consciousness, sub, un and waking. A bridge between this world and some unknown parallel dimension. A bridge, I must tell you now, that we at Nulltech intend to blow. Nick swallowed hard. Keep talking, he said, trying to sound tough, despite being bald. Whatever the innate quality of your fiction, Mr. Steen, and we at Nulltech deem it particularly lowbrow, the supernatural denizens of your imagination nevertheless now exist for real. They are alive and breathing, defying all laws of rationality and law. Crude works of visceral, paperback horror grown and suddenly incarnate. As such, Nulltech must treat these literary creations seriously, even if so no one else does. Right, thought, shaking his head. Like you understand visionary horror. The truth is, your escaping imagination is poised to destroy humanity. Our entire existence here in Stalford and beyond is threatened not just by the terrifying horrors you have unleashed, but by those burgeoning psychic powers latent within you. If you were to lead your continued, and if we were to let you continue on your current path, Mr. Steen, Those powers you were steadily gaining from each near accident would themselves become an agent of destruction, horrifying evil unleashed upon this world. Without you realizing it, your supposed noble intention of saving mankind from supernatural ruin would instead have the opposite effect. Those unchecked psychic powers, slowly manifesting themselves in your mind, would soon rain down destruction upon the world as colossal ego within your head swelled, ultimately turning on all who dared challenge it. Your hideous portentum of earthly destruction is essentially one of self-destruction. What the hell was she banging on about, wondered Nick. Exactly what hideous portentum of earthly destruction did she mean? Nick's holy vision of male pattern baldness? Surely that particular horror had already come to pass. Maybe Norman was making this whole thing up, just to justify balding him with impunity, keeping him here against his will, or slating her in print. And yet, Nick thought, breaking off his own train of thought, there was much in the vision that had yet to be explained, wasn't there? Those leathery, skin-covered airplane wings for one thing, and something else, Nick recalled, suddenly seeing the image clearly in his mind's eye again. The vast, bald hellscape below him, that barren, drying plain he'd been flying over. Maybe it wasn't just a vast floating human head after all. Maybe it was precisely what he thought it was when he'd first had a glimpse at it from above. A planet. Earth, maybe. Now a barren, empty, devastated world, entirely destroyed, or so it seemed to Nick. But by what? Did an answer to the riddle lie in the appalling symbolism of Nick's vision, a symbolism he'd so far failed to notice? Or if a dead planet was indeed what it was, resembled Nick's own head, swollen monstrously to a vast cosmic size, then did that mean that he, in fact, was the symbolic cause of the planet's ultimate ruin? Was he, Nick Steen, destroyer of worlds? Was Nick's vast swollen head, enraged by the sudden lack of hair, the first step in Earth's forthcoming apocalypse? Why don't you leave this whole thing to me, he said. After another 100 or so crashes, I'll easily have enough latent psychic powers to do battle with my own fictional outboard. That way, no one else gets hurt, apart from more passengers, and I get a Nobel Prize too. I'm afraid not, said Norman, as her lab assistants turned Nick's gurney around to face her again. She was back over by the mirror now, leaning up against it nonchalantly, one arm held casually over her chest, while the other held aloft, freshly lit cigarette. Your synapses have been wired to our central computer, she said, tapping ash into a nearby petri dish. Somewhere in the region of 100 million nerve cell fibers inside your brain are now connected directly into our main scanning sensors in the central probe. What central probe? Asked Nick. It's where we keep our main scanning sensors. One of the assistants held up a small mirror behind Nick's neck so they could see for the first time since he'd been shaved the back of his own head. He shuddered, almost gagging at the sight of confronting him. Of course, how else could they have seen into his mind? Nick's horror, a tangled cluster of wires and tube, had been fed into the back of his skull via precision-drilled holes, right through to his cerebellum and optical lobes. He was a freak. Norman lit a fresh cigarette, inhaling deeply, then leaned down and exhaled the smoke out of her own mouth directly into Nick's. He coughed, feeling the vaguest twitchings in his dormant manhood. Christ alive, he thought, this cow's turning me on. I'm going to seal up that hole in your head, she said, smiling at him almost playfully. I'm sure you'll let me do something like that to you. She extended her longest burgundious nail outward and stroked it upward under Nick's chin teasingly. Won't you? Nick swallowed hard. Nodded. End of chapter 3. Wow. Wow. God, what's gonna happen here? I can't even begin to imagine. Dear God. What has that bitch done to him? He's a monster. He's a freak. He's a weirdo. He'll never come back from this. Oh, how are we doing, chat? I'm checking in. Are you not too scared? You don't want me to stop, do you? I hope not. It would be very good if... No, okay, good. Just in case, it is a scary story, I'm aware. It's not for everyone. It's not for everyone. you know? I don't think he's getting the Neuralink for free. He's a very talented writer. Oh, I've got iced tea, I forgot. Sip of the iced tea again. A little sip of the iced tea. Oop. It's good iced tea. It's a shame Smug died. You know? It's a shame. He's with us in spirit. Rapper iced tea. No, this is a book. This is a book. It has that Lovecraft unease style of writing. Yeah, it does, doesn't it? You never know what's going to happen. You're always on edge here. What iced tea, Lipton? No, Sainsbury's. I've got Sainsbury's iced tea. You can't beat it, honestly. Guys, remember to like the stream. Follow and subscribe. Keeps the fireplace warm. Keeps the boot reading going. Whatever else. Now, 1's in chat if you want to keep going. 2's in chat if you're too scared and need to turn around to piss yourself. I want to know how you guys are doing. Oh yeah, also donate. It's true, Oscar. There's 1's in chat. 2's. Oh, someone's pissing themselves. Oh, got a couple of people pissing themselves. Oh, it's scary. You know what's even scarier? Not having autonomy. I'm gonna keep reading regardless of what you're saying. That's right. Right. Chapter 4. Phase 1. Let's meet Dr. Valsesco, said Norman. Immediately the two orderlies wheeled Nick over to the door in the far wall. At the push of a button, the panel slid aside to reveal a thin, declining ramp leading down towards into a darkened room below. With a sudden jolt, Nick felt himself dip forward as he slid slowly into the shadows. The room he entered was large and lit only by an eerie pinkish glow coming from a single monitor. The remainder of the area was steeped in a murky, impenetrable gloom. Nick looked around, seeing nothing, then heard the flick of a cigarette lighter somewhere ahead. A spark of light flared on the far side of the room, illuminating a slight, lab-coated figure standing silently in the shadows. Dr. Valsesco is an assistant chief head of Nulltech Corporation, said Norman from behind. Valsesco was short but thin, his expression seemingly forever held in a permanent knowing half-smile. If Norman hadn't pointed him out, Nick might never have known the guy had been standing there in the shadows. Beneath his neatly starched lab coat, Valsesco was wearing a formal slate grey suit. His sleekly silvered hair was thick and lustrous on top. His ice blue eyes glared cold. Then his gaze flicked right, like a reptile's, at one of the orderlies, who immediately flipped a switch, snapping on a row of overhead strip lights. Dr. Valsesco has been working on our prototype, said Norman, unsure what she was referring to. Nick scrutinised the interior of the room in greater detail. He could see now that the place was a testing laboratory of some kind, each white-panelled wall supporting a now customary bank of computer monitors and research desks. Then Nick caught sight of it, standing in the very centre of the room. A device. The thing appeared to consist of 2 units, the larger of the pair resembling a large metallic chair, which Nick felt was in sore need of a cushion. From its rear, a mesh of protruding wires connected this rudimentary seat to a row of electric panelling on one of the larger computer consoles behind. A form of head restraint, constructed in the shape of a half-oval like a sliced egg, hung suspended above it. Beside the chair, meanwhile, stood a box. For some reason, the second object unnerved Nick more than anything else he'd experienced so far. It was a small, metallic and rectangle in shape, suspended at chest height by the 4 long, thin-wheeled struts. 2 handles were attached to the rear side of the crate itself, and spaced evenly along one side were 3 large push buttons labelled powerful, and even more powerful. On top of the box was a red beacon that, when operated, Nick guessed, would revolve and flash like an emergency vehicle's siren. In front of this was a large riveted circular plate from which protruded a lengthy section of cable. This massive pipework, 10 inches in diameter and resembling an air conditioner's ducting hose, lay coiled in a large anaconda beside the box itself, culminating in what looked to Nick like an elaborately pinned plug outlet. The whole thing resembled the abandoned blueprint of some primitive supermarket trolley, one without space for one's shopping. Massive long legs and a huge cable sticking out of its interior mechanism, but maybe what frightened Nick most was about the contraption, for Nick had guessed it would be some sort of technical device, with 3 words inscribed upon its front-facing metal plate. The God Socket. Please, sire, a smidgen of context. This is a selective reading by author Garth Marenghi. It's book Pondscum. Our fellow friend here is an airplane pilot that survives every single air crash. Every single time he flies his plane, it crashes and everyone dies because his head has a god hole where all manners of horrible is coming out. It's very scary. I've shat myself 3 times already. What in hell's name is the God Socket? Asked Nick. An invention of mine, replied Norman, coming around from Nick's rear to stand beside the silver-haired scientist. Developed by Dr. Valzesco here, his team. One that will lead to far greater recognition than a mere Nobel Prize. What specifically is the God Socket? Asked Nick, realizing he was none the wiser despite Norman's answer and hoping a degree of qualification might help. The God Socket is essentially a small nuclear reactor housed inside a baking tin. Nick nodded. At least he now had some idea what the God Socket was. And what precisely does this God Socket do, he asked, seeking some additional clarification in addition to the previous additional clarification. Quite simply, Mr. Steen, nullify. Reading is hard. I'm dying of thirst over here. Meaning? Nick asked, aware that saying what nullifies would sound inelegant. We call the process nullification, continued Norman. The God Socket nullifies certain synapses in the brain. In your case, it will neuter your rampant imagination and, in layman's parlance, bung up the mind leak that you're currently suffering from. It's essentially the hand of God in a box. A sudden noise from the contraption drew Nick's attention. The red beacon on top lit up and began whirling in a circular motion in response to what sounded like Nick's ears, like the crack of a party popper somewhere inside its internal mechanism. The crate itself was starting to judder too, Nick noticed. With a second audible crack, a small cloud of smoke puffed upwards from the centre of the circular plate, which Nick now realised was an opening of some kind. Then the box went still again. I'm not going near that thing, declared Nick. You don't have to, said Norman. It will come to you. Beg your pardon. Put him in the chair. Valesco stepped forward, along with a row of hitherto unseen orderlies who had materialised suddenly from the surrounding shadows. Immediately, Nick felt himself being hoisted from his gurney and carried by several hands towards the strange-looking chair. Stop this, said Nick uselessly. Feeling the back of his head snag sharply at the clutch of wires drilled into the back of his skull caught on numerous hands. He winced as one of Valesco's assistants tripped over a heavy cabling still trailing behind Nick's back from the room above. Then he felt himself being twisted around, his head pushed roughly forward so the orderlies could unscramble the muddled wiring behind. As the cabling gradually became freed, someone yanked Nick's head backwards again. Before him stood Norman, smiling as she dragged deeply on a fresh cigarette. To his horror, Nick realised he had a full stonk on. Now, you may feel a small prick, she said, smirking. Very funny, Nick replied, trying to maintain a degree of dignity. What the hell were they doing to him? Here he was, being manhandled by an ice queen, whom he ought to be resisting with every fibre of his being. And yet, he was somehow completely powerless, with the wrong part of his anatomy instead rising to the occasion. Perhaps his mind was flashing back to those former days he'd spent servicing a dominatrix and sex-obsessed, cursed typewriter. But the truth was, Norman had him by the proverbial googles. and Nick, once again, was powerless to intervene on his own behalf. He prayed to God he'd been drugged with some sort of aphrodisiac serum, and wasn't just somehow perversely attracted to his female tormentor. I guess removing the R complex from the human brain wasn't enough for you, eh, Nolman? Said Nick as Valesco and his team strapped his body tightly to the chair. I guess becoming famous the world over for successfully removing the R complex, our deep-rooted reptilian instinct, also known as the base ganglia or basal nuclei containing the brainstem, limbic region, and the amygdala from human brain tissue, and thereby fast-tracking the next stage in mankind's evolution, didn't quite scratch your itch. Norman smiled, exhaling more smoke in his direction. Or maybe, continued Nick, coughing slightly, what happened to that poor chump you removed it from and put the kibosh on the whole evolution thing? Maybe that guy buying several gowns in different shades of green and retiring prematurely to yak-furred yurt somewhere in the middle of Epping Forest wasn't quite the titanic leap forward in human progress you'd envisioned. Is that it, Nolman? Is your ultimately full-hearted decision to remove the man's R complex, his deep-rooted instinct, also known as the base ganglia or the basal nuclei containing the brainstem, limbic region, and the amygdala, therefore turning him into a human aubergine? Was this what it is all really about? What was the point? No matter how much he might struggle with her, Nick knew that she knew he was putty in her hands. Let's face it was hard to hide a boner when that boner was no longer hidden. Why not just live with that? And maybe Norman was on the level after all. Maybe he had nothing whatsoever to worry about. And maybe, if Noltec did block up that hole in his mind, he could even ask Norman out for dinner tonight. Maybe invite himself back to her place to examine her noble, maybe even polish it for a brisk 5 minutes. Here's his pate, said Norman. Nick barely had time to take in those words when he felt several small needles pressing uncomfortably downwards against his hairless skull as the oval-shaped head restraint above him plunged downwards. He was receiving some form of cranial injections. He realised the head restraint piercing Nick's skull with what felt like 1,000 miniature pins. Relax, Mr. Steen, said Valesco, plugging the pinned end of the cable, which Nick presumed was the god socket itself, onto the top half of his head restraint. He glanced left and saw, with horror, that his brain was now fully wired up to the adjacent box. Norman withdrew to the far side of his room, which Nick now realised was divided from the central area by a glass partition, as several scientists began inputting data into a range of consoles. Norman held up a small microphone to her mouth and spoke, her voice hitting Nick's ears from a pair of overhead speakers. When Dr. Valesco presses the first button on the god socket, I want you to concentrate on imagining a nice sandy beach. Nick looked down in horror at the machine beside him. You mean the button marked powerful, he said, starting to sweat. The first button, yes, Norman replied, not the second or the third button. What happens if he does press the next button? The button marked more powerful. He will only press the button I tell him to press, which will be the first button marked powerful, not the second button which is marked more powerful. But what if Norman told Valesco to press the second button on purpose, Nick? The button marked more powerful. Then what? Or what about button 3, for that matter? The third button marked even more powerful. What happens if he presses this third button? Cried Nick, starting to stammer. Let's not consider that possibility, said Norman. The god socket is only a prototype, do you understand? No one is allowed to press button 3. The button is marked even more powerful, without my say-so, and they were to do so. She paused to light a fresh cigarette. Yes, Nick yelled. Were they to press button 3, the one marked even more powerful? What then? Norman exhaled, smoke hitting the glass panel in front of her, briefly obscuring her face. I daren't say what would happen then. If some fool were to foolishly press that button 3, the button marked even more powerful. What the hell was this damn thing? Nick asked himself, panicking. He tried to glance upwards at the cranial restraint encasing him. Useless. The wires protruding from his head leaned upwards into the machine itself, restricted all movement. Valesco finished making some rudimentary adjustments to the machine and maneuvered himself round to the side of the god socket, his finger poised over button 1. "Ready," he said. "Good," replied Norman from behind the screen, her voice coming through the loudspeaker above. "Very well, Dr. Valesco. You may press button 1. "No," said Nick, "please." Dr. Valesco pressed button 1. Smoke rose immediately from the box as its red beacon began to flash and whirl. The rectangular object began to judder and bounce as a vague grinding sound reverbed from somewhere within. The wheels on which the contraption was standing began to slide across the floor, triggering an automatic locking mechanism on each strut that instantly froze each leg in place. But that only seemed to cause the machine itself more aggravation, as if another burst of smoke, thickly black this time, shot upwards from between the metal grooves of the riveted circular plate from which the cabled socket extended. Nick's eyes caught sight of the pulsating movement surging through the cable now, moving upwards and over the intervening space until it finally disappeared into the cranial restraint above his own head. Then Nick felt the walls of his brain blasted inwards. A million destinations exploded deep inside his skull as bolts of searing pain shot through his internal synapses, triggering a flash of competing images inside his frazzling mind. At once, he was the pilot again, flying over that vast bald pate on leathered wings, yet falling now, crashing downwards in a terrifying death spiral towards the patched, airless surface below, where directly in the path of his deadly descent stood Roz, standing upwards in awe and terror at the approaching instrument of fiery, premature death. Then a cluster of other images flashed past Nick's vision as the pale, devastated ground below him drew ever closer. His family home in ruins, a teetering tower block. Then a host of heavenly angels descending upon him. Upon dumbstruck crowds gathered below, a gothic mansion by the sea aflame, a creepy doll, cooked breakfast. But that was because Nick hadn't eaten since his in-flight meal. 2 balls, evidently his own, given the botched tattoo on them that his wife had subsequently refused to pay for. The same daubed conkers now trapped in the mangling palatin of an ancient typewriter. Nick's own wife and daughter, far away, almost out of reach, yet still flipping him the bird. Then Roz again screamed and shrieking as Nick's wing-bone engine of destruction finally slammed into the ground. As Nick's mind impacted with it, the large plane of glass separating Nolman and her team from the god socket exploded into a billion shards. The shock snapped Nick's mind back into the present. He saw scientists reeling sideways to avoid the bursting glass, rolling left and right, shielding eyes and ears from exploding fragments, and Nolman standing tall amid the chaos, unmoved, undamaged, unconcerned. She dragged deeply on her cigarette, nodding to herself, and smiled. "I thought you were trying to weaken my powers," yelled Nick. "Not strengthen them." "Again," said Nolman. "No, damn it," cried Nick, as Valesco raised his finger once again over the button 1. "I said no!" Valesco pressed down a second time. At once the bulging surge shot from the box, faster this time, making its way over to Nick's head in only 3 or 4 seconds. Then another wave of explosions detonated inside Nick's skull, another portentum. Roz, now a charred and blackened skeleton, unrecognizable by her own impervious slickbacks. A world in ruin, baked dry by the drying sun, as men-beasts howled and gibbered and ate each other in caravans. A vast stone edifice of Nick's own face, a petrifying shriek of primal despair, leveling buildings to dust, felling millions upon millions in its path. Then a terrifying flapping of wings as the world went suddenly and prematurely dark. Nick opened his eyes and saw Nolman's technicians running for cover, running for their lives. Geez, Nick thought. I have the power. I have the power within me, the power to destroy. He looked over at Nolman, who stood still among the maelstrom, apparently unconcerned by Nick's display of uncontrollable psychic aggression. You lied to me, Nick hissed, struggling with his bonds. He'd lost his Stonkon completely now, and all he felt was rage. Sheer, blind rage. We have a slight problem, said Dr. Valesco, consulting a small computer printout coming from one of the nearby monitors. He's now able to channel those newly supercharged psychic powers directly. Nolman nodded. Put him out, she said. All at once, a group of security personnel in crash helmets, whom Nick hadn't previously noticed, leaped forward from the bench on the far side of the room and grabbed him. As their combined limbs struggled to force Nick's gaze away from Nolman's, the author cursed airline pilots fought savagely to escape the constraints of his chair, hoping to somehow fry his aggressors. Destroy them, said a strange voice deep inside Nick's mind. Destroy them all! His mind went blank, his face growing suddenly calm as his own eyes blazed with a hitherto unknown cosmic fury. One of the guards screamed out suddenly, grabbing his helmet in both hands as he collapsed to the floor, both eyes bubbling like hot mud. Then another security guard did the same, reaching downwards this time to his own groin, where two sharp patches of red had suddenly ruptured against his nylon trousers front as both lower balls exploded. Terminate the experiment, said Dr. Valesco. Calmly, coldly, Nolman continued to assess the ongoing situation. Fine, she said reluctantly. Terminate Phase 1. Valesco walked over to a small cabinet and drew out something from within, but Nick wasn't watching him. It was as if it wasn't even Nick anymore, for the voice inside the author's mind now sounded more like that of an empowered deity. A powerful new psychic ability had been awoken by Nick's fusion with the God Socket, and Steen now possessed, he felt perfectly sure, an ability to overcome and destroy all oppressors. Wrenching himself free from the security guards, Nick stared directly into Nolman's eyes, focusing his newly awoken mental powers on her face alone. He concentrated his mind, intent on bursting the Nobel Prize-winning brain situated in that lowly, backward skull into a million different pieces. Nolman lit yet another cigarette and blew several smoke rings at him through a fresh-looking pair of luscious burgundy lips. She's reapplied. A small part of Nick's head thought suddenly that ice-cold vixen was gone and reappeared. Phase 1 complete, said, as Dr. Valesco injected a syringe into Nick's arse. End of chapter 4. Wow. Fuck me, this is getting freaky. Fuck me, guys. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Oh man. I don't know about you guys, but I'm spooked. Become what he feared. The balls one was worse than the eye ones? Yeah. Blew his balls up. His balls got exploded, dude. Eating a muffin. I got a nice little muffin. I'm gonna try it. How many find the book? Chat. Do some opinions. Give me some reviews so far. How's it coming? How's it sound? I think he got snapped out of his trance via erection. I'm confused, but it makes me want to smoke. Makes sense. Oh man. What a journey. Once again, I have no idea what this is about. It's about a man who's got he's an ex-writer, and for some reason his writings are coming to life. His writings are coming to life. And something must be done. My God. I thought they were giving him a hair transplant. God only knows what they're giving him. Okay, but what does that have to do with blowing some guy's nuts off? Because he lost control. He was possessed by the spirit. An evil's presence is within his mind now, I think. Something like that. Yeah, but now he's getting tortured by a dominatrix. She's a scientist! Here's the guy. Oh my God. He's a man that knows what he likes. Right. Ready for chapter 5? I want to see 5s in chat if we want chapter. I need see some 5s in chat. I don't think he chose to blow the guy's nuts off. He just couldn't help it. He was trying to kill the doctor, and his powers were so horrible they blew some guy's nuts off. I'm seeing lots of 5s. Oh, there's a 4. Okay. Chapter 5. Scorcher and the Taffer. 0.5 still counts, Peanut. That's the number 5. I didn't say I didn't say it had to be value 5. I said I need to see 5. Gotcha. Another portentum. Nick watched the surface roll under him as he flew once more over the vast cosmic scalp. Blown by a powerful solar gale, Nick passed over what looked to him like a pair of vast oval lakes. Immense cyan blue ponds reflecting the starry heavens, yet marked all over by an intricate network of crimson vegetation shimmering below the surface. This blood-red mesh appeared to float among the swirling as Nick moved closer to the two lakes. Then he suddenly rose at speed, as though propelled by some powerful gust of energy from below. As Nick ascended above the two lakes, he gradually discerned two gigantic swirling eddies at the heart of each pool. Vast, spinning whirlpools of the deepest, darkest black. Eyes. He was looking down at a pair of gigantic eyes. His eyes. Nick woke with a yell and found that actually the eyes weren't his after all, but instead belonged to the head of a large golden retriever staring directly into his own. The dog's muzzle was resting in a gap between his feet, its jaws a mere yard from his vulnerable genitalia. Nick froze, keeping perfectly still, aware now that he was in some form of waiting room, spread eagle on another gurney with multiple wires still plugged into his head. These connected him, he saw as he risked a brief glimpse leftward to a portable power pack attached to a near-to-bursting catheter unit. "Easy boy," he said, turning again to the dog. The animal's eyes were a different colour now, glowing a metallic pink. As Nick watched, two iron clasps shot forth from the gurney's handrails, securing themselves around Nick's wrists. What the? As the dog's eyes shone an even brighter pink, a larger clasp sprung from the underside of the gurney and arched itself over Nick's chest, encasing his exposed midriff, trapping him against the trolley. Damn it! This dog was psychic. But I'm psychic too, thought Nick, or at least I was. Somehow Nick was no longer quite feeling like godlike rage within that recalled had been awakened by his encounter with the god socket. Perhaps the effect wore off once he'd been disconnected from the device. Concentrating his mental energies, Nick tried to blow the dog's innards inside out. He loved animals, but golden retrievers were like wasps, viciously aggressive, dangerous, and borderline lethal when swarming. Mankind was better off without them. He felt a familiar surge of psychic power welling up within his brain. Then there was something left inside there after all. Yet no sooner had the hound's bodily integrity begun reforming itself as Nick focused his psychic stare on the beast's rump, than the creature's eyes glowed pink again, more fiercely than before. Suddenly, two jets of pink flame shot outwards towards Nick's eyes, nullifying his own burst of psychic mind force midway, angling trajectory downwards towards the region of Nick's exposed loins. As a white-hot burst commenced to singe his particulars, the former author-turned-doomed airline pilot lost all control of his own concentrated burst of psychic energy, relenting at last to the unabated discharge of canine brain lasering from the most psychic of months. As the dog's two streams of pinked flame hovered were millimeters from the outer nestage of Nick's scrotal sac, they suddenly ceased, being spared. "You crazy cur!" gasped Nick, shaking his frazzled head in disbelief. "You nearly fried my future progeny." Then Nick saw it. A glare in the retriever's eyes, almost a smile, he sensed. And he knew that the creature had been merely toying with him. The dog had no intention of letting his balls go after all. As the retriever's eyes were glowed pink again, Nick prepared himself for the worst. Then a voice rattled loudly across the room in Pidgin Welsh. "Look you," it rasped. The dog bounded instantly from Nick's imperiled groin, skittering itself over the shiny waxed floor in pursuit of a sudden sprinkling of rolled snacks. Nick looked up as a tall, heavy-set figure struggled to enter the room via the doorway opposite. The man was broad-shouldered and evidently blind. His featureless eyes protruded from both sockets like two bulbous orbs of blanched scallop. He was struggling to determine the position of the doorframe, smacking a long, thick cane against both sides. Nick soon realised this cane was in fact a giant leek, hardened into a solid club, its surface lacquered with some form of ceramic glaze. The man's sore excuse for a lab coat was formed from a bright red flannel resembling a type of shawl or poncho. From it hung a collection of rudimentary charms and what looked to Nick like small dream catchers. These dangled variously from the man's pockets, shoulders and ears. His baggy trousers, meanwhile, were coloured with the pale green of a freshly harvested broadbean. Both legs were tucked tightly into a pair of chestnut brown leather riding boots, dating Nick's hazard guess from around the 19th century. The man's greying hair was long, thick, and dusted with yellow nicotine. Matted tufts hung low on either side of his face, which itself bore a tattooed image on one cheek of a monstrous leek next to a double-decker bus, with the legend Llangollen 67 emblazoned in red beneath. Slanting inwards atop the man's head stood a traditional Welsh hat, tall and speckled with dust. Nick could see why, as the man bashed it hard against the top frame of the door as he staggered through, stooping clumsily to gain full entrance. The long, polished leek in his right hand smacked to and fro across the floor, appending ornaments and knocking items of laboratory equipment to the ground. "Look you," the man bellowed again, smashing Nick's IV pole sideways with a large sweep of his leek. "No, look you," snapped Nick, as a large bag of bladder waste teetered for a second on the precipice, then rocked back again into the former standing position. "Don't you worry about that there bastard dog's boyo," said the man, raising his leek suddenly up his head, before slamming it down again across the gunnery side rails, striking a hidden catch that instantly freed Nick's clasps. The man then flung an outstretched hand in the region of Nick's feet and waited for him to shake it. "Up here," said Nick. The man ducked instinctively at something in the air, then turned his head and arm stiffly to the left. Wrong end. The man turned again, rotating his body in the opposite direction, until at long last his hand was pointing in the general area of Nick's body. Nick angled himself forward a couple of feet, guided the man's arm towards his own, and shook it. "Nick Steen," said Nick. "The Taffer," replied the man, who was known to all simply as the Taffer. Although his pale eyes sported no orbs, their cloudy irises burned deep with ancient wisdom, Nick sensed. Maybe Nick wondered then that this was one of them, one of the last living descendants of the true Welsh, the race of belligerent old ones mercilessly pushed westward by the marauding Anglo-Saxons hordes back in the early 17th century. A noble race of once heroic hunter-gatherers, now condemned to scrap a mere existence in the desperate groups gathered across a craggy grey wasteland known to the authorities as Wales. Many packed cruelly into blighted badlands, Cardiff and Swansea, still practicing their old religion of ancient Celticum, trading leeks for soil deposits in the vain hope of decent agricultural income one day, all while hawking loudly into spittoons for pennies at carnival freak shows. Here in the heart of Noltec, far from the relative security of the creature's native bogland, there stood before Nick a living, breathing example of this oppressed, once mighty civilization. The Welshman. "I come in peace," said Nick, aware the old chieftain's glazed leek could probably fell an ox. "You have to watch out for that scorcher, you see," said the Taffer, coaxing the golden retriever away from Nick's groin with a fresh handful of dog biscuits. "Not that I can watch out myself. Look you." He laughed, pointing up at his buggered eyes. "On account of my eyes, you see, or lack of them," he roared loudly. "Yes, I see. Lucky for you, boyo, because I certainly don't," he roared again even louder. "I get the picture," said Nick. "What picture? Where?" the Taffer said, looking blindly around the room. "What in God's name's a picture anyway? When's it at home? I can't see a bloody thing, me." "A picture's a visual illustration of something." "And what the bloody hell's a visual illustration, might I ask?" "What's visual? I've no vision. And what's this something you be blathering on about, boyo? Could be anything with me, given that I can't see a bloody thing on account of me having no eyes in my head. Look you." Nick felt his temper rising, then saw that the Taffer was no longer laughing. The old Welshman's expression had suddenly grown grave. "But," said the Taffer, reaching upward with his free hand to tap the side of his own head, "I see all." Unnerved, Nick looked away from the Welshman's cloudy eyes and watched the dog gobble up its last biscuit, then sit, licking both its testicles for stray crumbs. "Scorcher, is it?" growled Nick. "An apt moniker. Who or what saw that hound to throw flame?" "He's part of Project Inferno," growled the Taffer, moving around behind Nick to grab the gurney's handles, inadvertently knocking a large jug of water to the floor. "Oh, now look what I've bloody done. If I could look, that is." "What is Project Inferno?" said Nick, attempting to head things off at the... "Well, I shouldn't really be telling you, boyo," the man said, as he wheeled Nick over to the door before slamming him into a neighbouring wall instead. He widened his mouth considerably for the next sentence, for the project, you see, is still active. Despite the massive wires fixed to the back of his head, Nick could still feel a large spray of saliva striking home as the Taffer hawked his unholy mix of glottal slops and harsh poscudence at the direction of Nick's skull. Project Inferno, you see, is a program designed to turn domestic animals into potential arsonists. "As a weapon for the government, I presume," said Nick, crying, as the Taffer reversed, then slammed him once more into the wall. "Noltec don't officially engage in any nefarious activity, Mr. Steen. Officially, we're turning these dogs into fire-projecting killers so we can send them into flooded areas to assist with drainage issues. And we could do with some of that in Langrog, if I'm honest, which generally I'm not." "Drainage issues? That's bullshit," thought Nick, then felt his spine judder a third time as he was once again rammed into the wall. "I can walk, by the way." No, boyo, you sit there. Old Taffer will take you to where you need to go." "Go right about half an inch, then move forwards," snapped grumpily. "What's half an inch when it's at home?" replied the Taffer, nevertheless doing as instructed. Nick breathed a sigh of relief. Finally, they were moving through the doorway into the corridor beyond. "If that dog's a fire projector," he began, A flamer, interrupted the Taffer, showing Nick's neck with a spit again. That's the technical phrase. Flamer, Nick continued, trying his best to ignore the shower of saliva. Then how come it is also able to achieve the mental class, activate the mental class on the gurney? Like I said, boyo, the project backfired. Scorchers developed powerful Please don't say that word. Or at least give me a towel. Powerful additional abilities. Those damn maniacs, muttered Nick to himself. Not all of us. The Taffer halted the trolley before shuffling his weight around it to face Nick out on. He wasn't sure what was about to happen. Had Nick offended the Welshman somehow? Before he could figure out what he'd done, the Taffer reached up with both hands to his dead eyes and, to Nick's horror, plucked them out. Nick screwed his own orbs shut in revulsion. Look you, intoned the Taffer sternly. Look you. Bracing himself, Nick opened his eyes again, expecting to see the Taffer's dry, empty sockets, but finding instead a perfectly ordinary pair of healthy cobalt blue peepers. Eggshells, you see, said the Taffer, winking at him, while dangling his fake pale blinders on the length of grubby string. Lasered, boyo, like my prized leak, Langolan 67. Bigger than a bloody bus it was. Shrunk a bit over the years, of course. No, I'm not blind at all, boyo, the Taffer winked at Nick in a mysterious fashion, but I see all. As quickly as he plucked them out, the Welshman popped his blind eyes back in and swished his leak clumsily along the corridor again, then rammed Nick into several more walls. And believe me, boyo, you need to see this place, said the Welshman, steering Nick towards the elevator doors. As he pushed inside, the gurney striking the door edge several more times on the way in. Nick caught sight of the Taffer's face, staring blindly ahead of them, and reflected back to him in the mirrored wall panel. Look you, Nick Steen, the Welshman whispered gravely, as if suddenly being afraid of overheard. Remember it well. Look you. The lift doors opened on a thin rectangular-shaped room. Banks of monitors and computer equipment lined every wall except one, which itself consisted almost entirely of a wide plane of glass. The Taffer wheeled Nick up to what he saw was an observation window overlooking a large lecture theatre below. Nick leaned forward in the gurney and detected rows of tiered seating leading down into a semicircular stage. On the distant platform stood 5 lecterns, each spotlit by a studio-grade lighting with a microphone wired up to each one. As Nick watched, the seats below him began filling up with various scientists and technicians, watched by assorted representatives in dark suits, whom Nick realised formed yet more of Naltec's significant security detail. Evidently an important event of some kind was imminent. So entranced was Nick becoming with the milling experts below that he failed to notice another team of assistants simultaneously entering the observation area behind him. I sincerely hope you will recuperate with Phase 2, said Norman, approaching from Nick's rear. The Taffer turned Nick around so that he was facing her. Just so you know, we have Scorcher on standby, she added. That mutt takes the damned biscuits. And I mean literally, Norman. 5 smackos were all that stood between my genital and tomorrow's poop bag. The canine's aggression is largely a side effect, explained the chief scientist. A result, we believe, on connecting up its genitals to the god's socket instead of its tail. Nolman stood aside to reveal Dr. Valesco approaching from an adjacent room, wheeling in a device to which Nick had previously been connected. Several assistants followed the doctor in, carrying the chair itself and the length of cable protruding from the machine's lid. As Nick watched, they began connecting the cable socket to the outlet above the chair's oval restraint. We'll try plugging it in this time, said Nom. I think the issue may have been a faulty connection. Balls, said Nick. You supercharged me psychically, Nolman, and you know it. For what reason? What nefarious purpose am I, and by literal extension, the god socket, serving here? You can plug him in now, Nolman says, ignoring him. With pleasure, replied Valesco, squeezing a large glob of luminescent pink jelly onto Nick's pate. Conducting gel, he said, enigmatically. As Nick felt himself start to panic again, he caught sight of Nolman's tugging on a pair of thin surgical gloves, At the bruising snap of swiftly released latex, she ushered Valesco aside and reached out with both hands, smoothing the gel onto Nick's pate with her fingers in a circular, almost sensual motion. Not again, thought Nick, becoming instantly aroused. Distracted against his will by Nolman's crazy cranial massage, Nick shut his eyes, trying hard to think of Sulfurg and ignore her gentle, sensuous squeezing. In this state, he failed to notice the god socket and connecting chair being wheeled over to the window behind him. Then he screamed, eyes snapping open as he felt himself being hoisted up from the gurney into the seat now positioned directly beside him. "What are you going to do to me? Relax, boyo," said the Taffer, wheeling an empty gurney aside. Nick glanced down at the god socket beside him, hearing the familiar grinding sound coming from within the box, while intermittent bursts of acrid smoke escaped around the sealed edge of the riveted cable panel. Then what felt like a large metallic toilet roll tube plunged down towards once more into Nick's skull, its circular steel blade rooting itself inward through Nick's previous incision. Again, his mind went dizzy as the anesthetic serum contained within the helmet went to work. When Nick roused his head from drowsiness moments later, Nolman was beside him, watching the crowd in the lecture hall below. Hearing Nick fart loudly, she turned to face him. "Charming," she said. "Welcome back." "I'm not in control of my physical faculties," said Nick, slurring. "Evidently," she said, nodding downward at Nick's lingering shame. "Look, it just won't go all right," he said, half suspecting Nolman was manipulating the damn thing via medical means. "Please," she said, signaling Nick to look downwards. The crowd gathered in the lecture theatre below. The place was full now, and there was palpable air of expectation rising in the hall. One of Valesco's assistants flipped on a switch nearby, computer, and two wall speakers angled above Nick's head began piping in sound from below. As the lights in the lecture hall dimmed, Nick observed a grey-haired scientist walk out onto the stage. The seated audience grew silent. "That's Professor Torch," whispered Noel, the running joke being that he never runs out of batteries, which I must confess I don't get. "Don't get?" Nick stared up at her incredulous. "You can't take it from me, Nolman," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "That's funny." Below them, Professor Torch stood shuffling his papers at one of the lecterns and then reached into his lab coat for his reading glasses, only to draw out a flashlight instead. The audience, and Nick too, burst into violent howls of laughter. "The guy's just got it," said Nick, half choking. "He's just got it." Nolman remained silent, unmoved and stony faced. Christ, thought, lighten up, woman. As Professor Torch feigned sudden recollection, tutting long and sufferingly to himself, he reached into his other pocket instead and brought out a second flashlight. Nick practically doubled up, striking the pane loudly as he laughed. "Be careful," snapped Nolman, suddenly yanking Nick's hand from the glass. "It's vital you don't draw any attention to yourself." "Whatever you say, lady," said Nick, rolling his eyes. He felt vaguely relieved, though. With this level of everyday why-hit humour around at Niltic, maybe being incarcerated in this place wouldn't be quite so bad after all. But his smile dried up and his mind suddenly took in the full implication of Nolman's words. "What do you mean, don't draw attention to myself?" "This is mirrored glass," said Nolman, "meaning you can see them, but they can't see you." Now, why would that be important, wondered Nick, as he turned his attention back to the lecture hall. Professor Torch had finally found a pen behind his ear where it had been hiding all along, much to the audience's amusement, and was now in the process of introducing 5 guest speakers currently waiting in the wings. "Turn it up." Valesco's assistant twisted a dial, increasing the volume of the walled speakers. Nick craned his neck, listening carefully to the professor's speech. For tonight's winner of the Nolman Prize for Literature is unique in this field, regarded by many as a groundbreaking author of truly visionary horror. Nick glanced up at Nolman. She smiled down at him, then winked, unsure what was happening or about to happen. Nick turned back to the window with a vague sense of apprehension, mixed with the nascent pride at his own achievements. "And yet, of course," continued Professor Torch, "he is anything but to discuss Mr. Scene's woeful output, which even now threatens the very existence of mankind, and to dissect in the full depth of literary quality in the published works, along with their stunningly poor sales figures of late. please welcome to the stage a gathering of Stalfolk's most esteemed literary critics. Nick felt a rush of repressed fury as 5 figures entered the lecture theatre from the stage wings, each clutching a coloured ring binder in their hands, along with assorted copies of Nick's books. One by one, the critics took their place behind the arranged lecterns and stared out across the assembly. Nick knew all about them, and thought they might call themselves critics. Nick had always referred to them as arseholes, for these 5 were the most savage, illiterate hack reviewers he'd ever had the displeasure of being quoted by. For decades, Nick had been forced to endure a litany of appalling reviews from all 5, year after year, scorned paperback masterpiece after scorned paperback masterpiece. They were all pricks. Though he hated giving these wankers the time of day, Nick could nevertheless name all 5 if he had to, and quote verbatim from their scathing reviews to boot. Foremost among them was J. Jacob, who obliterated Nick's groundbreaking body horror, The Water Boatman, in which a doomed scientist accidentally turns himself into half a water boat. Only oars for hands. Then there was Bunty Hosewood, the self-styled human mouth, who routinely decimated Nick's long-running gothic crime series, Frankenstein, E.I. Even though she'd apparently grown up reading them all before herself discovering they were all wrong. After her came Nev Wist, a former master's student at Leeds Polytechnic, who based his university thesis around Nick's gothic vampire classic Warlocks. The thesis had been subsequently published as Total Warlocks, more like, and was in short a damning critique of the novel, which Nick only discovered while browsing its pages, having already signed and publicly endorsed multiple copies for a modest fee. Sturgeon Rank, who famously burned multiple copies of Nick's books in a car park behind Stalfolk's library during a visit to promote his own gardening crime series, came next, followed immediately by Glinda Arrow, a writer of horror fiction for the young adult market, whom Nick was convinced wanted to get inside of Rank's pants. She frequently stole ideas from Nick's books, dumbing them down for her illiterate readership. Nick had eventually grown so tired of their public takedowns of his oeuvre that he'd hired a local hitman to bump them all off, only to discover said hitman was in fact a fraudulent tradesman and had in reality spent the entirety of Nick's deposit on a cheap package holiday for him and the family, knowing full well Nick wouldn't be able to sue him for blatantly reneging on their deal owing to the potential legal inherent in its apparent sanctioning of mass murder. "I don't want to watch this," said Nick, as Jake Jacob shuffled the papers in hands and began to speak. "And yet you will," replied Norman. As Jacob commenced his latest public takedown of Nick's supposed achievements, Nick closed his mind, clamping his hands over both ears. Despite this attempt to muffle the noise from below, he was still able to distinguish words excruciating, risible, and purple prose, for his arms were yanked free from his head by Valesco's men and clamped tightly to the arms of the chair. This is when Norman said, "Press button 2. Panicked, Nick glanced left, horrified, as Dr. Valesco pressed button marked "More Powerful." "What the hell?" cried Nick, as a sudden spark of pink flame shot forth from the god socket, travelling fast through the connecting cable into Nick's head. As the box began to smoke, Nick felt his body convulse with a violent surge of electrical power, contorting his limbs into unearthly shapes as a more powerful of energy coursed through his brain. He was smoking now, like the god socket beside him, and amidst the fumes he felt himself burning up. A seething rage, centred at first in what felt like the very depths of his brain, coursed through his veins like a stream of molten lava, pumping boiling blood through his arteries as the bruised ego within him swelled to murderous proportions. "Destroy them," said the same voice in Nick's head. "Destroy them all." No, Nick, because he knew the voice wasn't his. It was the god socket speaking. Surely, some kind of malevolent deity contained in the small metal box beside him. Surely Nick Steen wasn't capable of such an evil, destructive voice. But then, hadn't Nick already invested £100 of his own money on a failed assassination ploy? Wasn't this destructive voice in his head in fact merely a manifestation of those destructive powers of darkness already laying dormant in his own mind? "Destroy them all." That voice again, ordering him, compelling him, forcing him. Nick fought against his own worst instincts to silence the command, but that meant all he could hear was a tidal wave of mocking laughter from below as each critic read loud passages from Nick's books, gleefully tearing out each offending page or casting it into the baying crowd like some macabre trophy of war, which ultimately decided the matter. Nick Steen would destroy them all. That was chapter 5. Wow, what an evening we're having. I think, just like me, yeah, he's just like me for real. I think on this cliffhanger, leave it for tonight. I didn't want to leave you wanting without Smug here, without an episode of Pondscum this week to enjoy. I hope this met your lofty standards as an audience, as standards you have for me as a content creator. If you want more, make sure to donate and be like more, or say something on the Patreon, or I don't know, somewhere else. I don't know. I don't know how to do this. Thank you all for coming. I love you all. Forehead kisses. This has been Reading with Wiz. I hope you have a great evening, and you can sleep well tonight, hopefully without the horrors pursuing you or going bald. Good night.